Well, well, what has the cat dragged in today? It's a video tutorial on character controllers. Well, sort of. I mean, it's going to be a pretty basic tank third person character controller, but it does technically meet the definition. Alright, let's be real here. A character controller can be a horrifically complex thing to develop. We could quite easily spend a 20 video long sequence on analyzing and developing a character controller and the corresponding camera controller to do a third person perspective game. That's not what this tutorial sequence is about. This is about showing the basics and introducing ideas and concepts. So we're going to keep things pretty darn straightforward and simple. We're going to have a fixed camera that's just going to automatically follow along with the player. We're going to have no mouse control. Everything's going to be keyboard driven. And we are only going to use the vertical and horizontal axes to control our character. Horizontal for rotating left and right, and the vertical for moving forwards and backwards. Hence the reference to tank controls. We have to rotate the character because we always move straight forward. So, relatively simple, relatively easy to develop. We can do it in a single video. That's the direction we're going. Now, before I dig into that, you may notice since the last video that my player character has suddenly developed red hair. I got a little bit bored off camera and decided to mess around with the colors a little bit, and then realized that, you know what, I should probably show you guys how to do that too. So if you dig into the Polygon Starter folder and go into Materials, so in other words, I'm from Assets, I go to Polygon Starter, and then Materials, you will see that you have 4 different materials. This corresponds to the 4 different colors you have available to you. Material 1 is the default blue that you always get. Material 2 is red. Material 3 is gray. And material 4 is yellow. So say I wanted to make the enemy characters yellow to make sure they pop out and stand out from the rest of the level. I could drag the material onto the body mesh and release, and now the body is yellow. Notice the hair does not automatically change. The hair is a separate mesh. So if I want the hair to match, I would then have to re-drag out the material onto the hair and release. And there we go. Now the enemy is all yellow, and my main character is a redhead now. Okay, that's enough about colors. Let's talk about controllers. Now, I already have a macro folder set up, and actually I do need to delete that out. Pretend you didn't see that. That was from a previous failed recording. So you are going to want to create a macros folder. Again, is this technically necessary? No, but you want to always keep your stuff well organized. And we are going to create a, as I suddenly space on the word, a flow macro. There we go. So I am going to right-click, create, bolt, flow macro. And I am going to be momentarily confused as to why that didn't work. Well, my whole computer just hitched right there, so let's try this again. So right-click, create, bolt, flow macro. There we go. Worked on the second try. And I'm going to call this player rotate. You could also call it rotate player. It honestly doesn't matter. I ping pong back and forth as to what I call this thing. Once you have that created, we are going to edit the graph. So I'm going to click on Edit Graph. Normally, I would have my flow graph window off on my second monitor. Off on my second monitor for extra workspace, but obviously can't do that in this scenario. So in the center it goes. Now, what is this macro going to do? This macro is going to be just responsible for rotating the player character left and right based on the horizontal axis. Since they're hard. Since this is something we want to do every frame, we're going to need an update. A hook into update. So I'm going to right click, and you can either search for it by typing in the word update, which if this is the first time you're doing this, it might take it a second or two to actually build up the list. Or you could go into the events lifecycle and choose the update event from there. And so what we're going to need to do every frame is we are going to need to query the input axes for the value of horizontal, just like we've done in past projects. So I'm going to use input.getAxis. The axis in question is horizontal, so I'm going to type that into the axis name. And then the action that I'm going to chain off of that is going to be the actual rotation. As I mentioned before, anytime we're dealing with rotation, scale, or moving an object, that is going to be under the transform. And in this particular case, we're going to want to use this version of transform.rotate, where we specify an axis and we rotate this number of degrees. Now, I could specify a 1 here in the axes, but I don't like doing that. This is what's called a magic number in programming. What does it represent? I don't know. What does it do? I don't know. How does it work? It's magic. Hence the term. Now, obviously, it's fairly clear in this scenario what the 1 is doing. That's the y value. So I'm saying rotate around the positive y, or up. But honestly, if it's reasonable amount of effort, I like being very explicit. And as it turns out, there is literally a transform up property that we can access. So this is much clearer. There's no misunderstanding. I am rotating around the up vector. Now, what value do I feed into here? I do not want to just connect those straight. Instead, I need to multiply, because remember, this is going to be in a range from -1 to 1. -1 if we're rotating left, 1 if we're rotating right, 0 if we're not rotating at all. So I'm going to take that value and multiply it by my rotation speed. Now, the rotation speed is something that I am going to want to be visible in the inspector. And if I want something to be visible in the inspector without having to go into the flow graph window, that means it either must be an object variable or a scene variable. In this particular case, I'm going to choose object variable. And since this macro is not connected to anything, I am going to have to just type in the name, which I'm going to give it the name rotate speed. Now, if I left it at this, I would be representing this in terms of degrees per frame, which is very much not what I want. I want this to be in degrees per second, which means I have to take this output and further multiply it by time.delta time. It is very rare that I'm going to want to do a numerical value on a per frame basis. I almost always want to express things in terms of per second, or in the using time.delta time to figure out what fraction of a second it has been since the last time I did this. And that value, hold up, that's a subtract. That's not a multiply. There we go. And that's the value that I feed into angle. So now that I have a testable section of code, I want to test it. Now, before I do that, there's two things I need to do to my player. Well, technically, one thing. The second thing that I need to do really isn't applicable until I start trying to move it, but I got to do it anyways. And that is, I need to have a collision on here. Remember from past projects, if we want something to move through the world and be able to interact with other objects, it has to have a rigid body and it has to have a collider. Only we're going to cheat here slightly because there's a lot that goes into attempting to move a character in three-dimensional space and have sensible things like gravity and colliding with floors and not walking through walls and so on and so forth. So we're going to use a little bit of a Unity shortcut. And we are going to add on the character controller component. I both love and despise this component. I love it because it wraps a whole lot of tedious functionality up into itself, so that way we don't have to worry about that tedious functionality and we can just create a basic character controller. I despise it because it hides way too much. For the moment, just simply accept my word on the fact that even though you don't see a collider or a rigid body component on this object, there is indeed a rigid body and a collider on this object. The collider we can actually somewhat see. If we look into the scene value, we can see that we have a capsule outline now on our character. Horribly misplaced, but we do have a capsule outline. This is our collider that we get to work with. Now, obviously, this needs a little bit of adjustment. And so we're going to come over here to our character controller component. We're going to change the center to 1. You can see that reasonably fits our character. It might be a little bit on the high side. That is a reasonable fit. But it's also very, very wide. If we look at like how wide this capsule is compared to the rest of the body, that's not really good because that means I won't be able to get any closer than that to a wall. So yeah, I don't want that. So I'm going to change the radius down to 0.25. And as you can see, that makes things much, much more slender. And so those values adjusted, our character controller is good to go. Just very briefly, what do these other things do? Slope limit, 45 degrees. That's basically saying that if I'm trying to go up a slope that is greater than 45 degrees, don't let me. Step offset, if I hit a ledge that is that value or less, my character will basically teleport up onto it. And then skin width is something that is used to prevent weird collisions or getting embedded into walls or things like that. And general is not something you should ever touch unless you really know what you're doing. And then finally, center, radius, and height are, well, relatively self-explanatory values. Where is the center of the capsule collider? What is its radius? What is its height? And now with this character controller on, we can add on our flow macro. So I'm going to add component. And I'm going to go into bolt. And I'm going to add on a flow machine. And in the macro component here, I'm going to drag in the player rotate. So that way my player rotate is in position, ready to go. Now, from a previous session, we should already have our camera set up so that we can see the whole scene back from when we were testing the idle animations. So I'm going to hit the play button. They are idling. And A and D isn't doing anything. It's like, what is going on? Remember, anytime that you have a piece of functionality that you swear is supposed to work, but it doesn't, the very first place that we should always look is down here, or just switch over to the console and see if we have any error messages. Because we always want to resolve red exclamation, or the stop sign exclamation symbols here, because those are critical errors. Always want to resolve those. And I'm currently being yelled at that rotate speed does not exist. This is a common error that you can get when dealing with macros, where you set the macro variable while you're developing the macro and then forget to actually create it on the object. Sure enough, if I look at my variables list here, does not exist. I don't have rotate speed. So I need to create that. And of course, that needs to be a float. As far as to the value, remember this is going to be expressed in degrees per second. How far do I want to be able to turn in a single second? I'm going to start off with a value of 90 here. Hit the play button. And there we go. I can see the character turning. So yay, it works. Things to check if your character isn't turning. Check to make sure that you didn't forget to put in a value here, because if you have a rotational speed of 0, then obviously not much is going to happen. Also check your flow graph to make sure that you aren't attempting to feed the horizontal value directly into rotate, because yeah, attempting to rotate 1 degree per frame is going to make you rotate very slowly. And yeah, that's actually about the only 2 areas I can really think of that might be messing things up in this particular case. Now, before I move on to movement, I do want to fix my camera. So at the moment, my main camera is not connected to the player. That's not what I want to have happen. So I am going to make the camera a child of the player. I am going to reset the camera's transform, and then proceed to adjust the position. I'm also going to adjust the field of view. I think 75 for a field of view for a third-person game is better than 60, but that's, I don't know, a bit of a personal preference and actually has absolutely nothing to do with the functionality of this. I'm going to tilt it down a little bit. Adjust it. Turn on maximize on play. Whoops, I'm on free aspect. Oh well. Turn that over to 1920 by 1080 in a moment. Yeah, and especially from this angle, a 90-degree turn amount feels pretty good. I think if I went much faster than this, it would feel out of control. Oops, I meant 1920 by 1080. There we go. So that's rotate. Let's get our move out of the way. Coming back over here to my macro folder. I'm going to right click, create flow macro. player move, edit that graph. Again, this is something that I'm going to be doing every frame. So I'm going to need that update. This time I'll go through the life cycle. So events, life cycle, and there's update. Once again, I'm going to ask the question, what is my vertical input? So input to get axes, and this time I'm looking for vertical. Now I'm going to want to remember this value. I don't want to use it yet, although I suppose I could. Because I need to set an animator float here. But because I want to actually use a flow variable, and that's really about the only reason why, I'm not going to do the set animator float command here. I want to do it at the very end of the chain. So I need to remember this value, but it's not a value that I need to remember across multiple frames, since at the start of every frame, I'm always recalculating this value. So this is a perfect example of using a flow variable. So I am going to drag this out. I'm going to use variables. I'm going to use flow, set flow variable, and vertical with the lowercase v. And I'm going to feed that value into it. So here we go, a perfect example of using a flow variable. Now, I'm also going to have to do a lot of calculations. So the first thing I need to do is figure out what is the magnitude of how far do I want to move. And that's going to be this vertical value times my movement speed. So that's going to be another thing that I'm going to want to be able to edit in the inspector. So that's going to be another object variable. And I'm going to call this move speed. As per usual, I want to express this in terms of units per second. So I have to take this move speed and then multiply it by time.delta time. And then, because we're not done yet with the multiplications, and then I have to multiply this by my forward vector, because I don't know what my rotation is. So I can't just move along the z-axis. I don't know where I'm pointing. But the forward vector, which is something the transform always knows, is always pointing in the relative forward of the model, which is the relative positive z of the game object. And so if I take this value and multiply it yet again, now this time I don't want to use this multiply. Pay very close attention to the description of it. Returns the product of two scalars. In other words, two numbers. A vector isn't a number, it's three numbers. So I do not want to use this multiply. Instead, I need to go down to the math category and go into generic and use that version of multiply. And I am going to multiply it by transform.forward_get. So again, this whole sequence of multiplications. Get my axis. Multiply it by my movement speed. Multiply that by time.delta time to express my movement in units per second. And then multiply that by my forward vector to get a vector that I can feed into the character controller, telling the character controller in what direction and how far to move. So the final, well, I shouldn't say the final, because we still have other commands to do. The next thing we need to do, command-wise, is I need to use the character controller move. So I'm going to type in character controller dot move. We don't want to use simple move, we want to use move. Now, what motion are we going to move with? Well, here's where we get to make a little bit of a decision. Assuming that you want a very simple character controller, we can just yoink that over and call it a day. Now, this does have one very important drawback. We have no gravity. No gravity will be applied to this character controller. So if you want to be able to use ramps or stairs in your level, this will not work. Instead, we need to add a gravity value in here. Now, we're not going to actually use the gravity value. We're going to cheat a little bit. And we are going to use the vector3 dot y set. And we're going to set the y to -1. Now, we have to expose this, so actually I do need to switch to full screen here so that I can click chainable, because we need to chain the vector off of this. So this is what my final form looks like. So to go back over this again briefly, as of this multiply right here, I have a functional vector that I can feed into the character controller.move method in order to move my controller. But I will not have gravity. I will not be able to effectively go down a ramp. I have to make sure that I apply gravity to my character controller. Now, in this particular case, we are applying a brain-dead simple solution of every frame having a -1 force pushing down on the character. This is going to make the character snap fairly hard to the ground as they move down a ramp or anything like that. Which is fine, because we're not going to mess with jumping. That's an entirely separate kettle of fish. So do be aware this is a little bit of a hack, but it'll get us functional ramps and stairs if you so desire to have that in your level. There's one last thing that we have to do, and then we'll test and wrap up this video because it's getting awfully long. And that is we have to set the animator parameter. Remember, when we set up our animator, we have this vertical parameter that controls what animation we play. So after I move the character, I need to set an animator property. So animator is the component. So I'm going to type in animator dot. And what do I need to do? Well, I need to set a float. So I'm going to say set float. Here we go. Animator.setFloat name, comma, value. That is almost always the version that you want to use. What is the name? The The name is vertical. What is the value? It's that flow variable that we created earlier, mainly because I wanted to give an excellent example of, yes, this is where you would use a flow variable. Could honestly also put that right here, and it would work just as well. But like I said, great demonstration of a scenario where a flow variable is actually useful. Now, functional piece of code, let's test it. So leave full screen, make sure my scene is saved with a Control S, hit the play button. Can I still rotate? Yes. Can I move forward? No. And the observant amongst you are probably going, wait a minute, Grasscat, you didn't even bother adding the macro onto the character. Yeah, no, I didn't. Yeah, that was a totally unscripted error. So add component, flow machine, drag in the player move. There we go. And while I'm thinking of it, I also need that move speed. Which I'll set as a float. And give myself a move speed of 8. And apparently I miswired something because I'm getting another one of those errors. Now, let's take a look at this. This is actually not an error that I intended to have, so that just means that I mishooked something up. So what does it say? The value of target output cannot be fetched dynamically. It must be assigned. On set member. So I am guessing that is something to do. Let's see here, player move. I'm guessing it has something to do with this right here. I must have goofed on... Oh yeah, I don't think I can have this block free floating like this. So this isn't a particularly helpful error message in that I can't quite tell what's wrong with it. Although looking at this, I can see, yeah, I forgot to have this block hooked into the flow of things. So that's what's causing the issue. But if you're not entirely sure, dock your flow graph such that you can see it. Make sure that my player is selected, and I want the player move macro. Ah, there we go. Now I've got the red color. And then if I hit the run and not forget to take myself off of full screen, I can see, yep, the pulses are stopping right there, and this one is red. It is general, some bolt actions can be done like this, just sort of chained separately, but some cannot. And so the simple fix here is to do it like this. And now it works. The exact reason as to why that is so gets a little bit esoteric, so just accept the fact that if you have a bolt error, and let me bring that back up. That was not an intentional error, but it's certainly a good one to have. Get rid of that wire. So if you have a bolt error complaining about cannot be fetched dynamically, it's complaining about something similar to this. You have a variable that you are trying to use dynamically and it doesn't like it. That means if you've got the case of a block like this that has flow links, make sure that it is, in fact, linked into the flow. And sometimes that means having a multiple get variables. So that's what it means by when it's complaining about fetch dynamically. If you got flow links, link them up. Otherwise, use a fresh get variable, and that will usually solve that error. And there we go. Bit of a long video for a fairly basic character controller, but it works. You should not be able to run through any of the obstacles. Can't run through the wall. I can run through the other player or the enemy because, well, there's no functionality or collision information on that object yet. And if you walk off the edge, yes, you will instantly start falling, but that's something we'll solve in the level design phase. All right, I warned you character controllers were complicated. Almost 40 minutes for this basic thing. I can only imagine how complex this would be if we were also going to toss in jumping and mouse control and allowing the player to adjust the camera and all of the other things typically associated with a character controller. But this is basic, it'll get the job done, and we can now move on to other tasks, specifically setting up the enemy. And so, if you enjoyed this video and picked up some new tips and tricks, a like would be appreciated, and if I just bored you with information you already knew, well, the dislike button is right next to it. Until next time.